Okay, let's talk a little bit about this week's reading assignment. The reading assignment for week 3. Most of what you'll be reading are primary source documents from your textbook. Page numbers are listed. These first few documents all come straight out of the convention. Just as a refresher, the 13 states, actually 12 of the 13 states, since Rhode Island chose not to participate in the convention, were purportedly meeting in Philadelphia to fix the Articles of Confederation. They were going to amend the Articles to make them work and create a stronger federal system, or national system, I should say, because the problem with the Articles is it wasn't a federal system, it was a confederal system. So instead of fixing the Articles, they did choose to create a constitution, a whole separate document that did create a federal system. And that's the system we got today. So anyways, you'll be reading some of the different proposals that were submitted to the convention, argued in convention, debated, and all of these proposals were worked out. And over the course of a few months there in Philadelphia, they debated the different proposals and obviously came up with a final product. And this is why the Constitution is not up, it's not perfect. It doesn't please everyone. It was the compromise that was reached between these 12 states that all had very different plans for what they wanted. And it'll become clear as you start to read through these documents that explain the proposal. So your first one is from a guy named Edmund Randolph. It's his Virginia plan. He was a lawyer from Virginia. A lot of these delegates were lawyers. They practiced law, and if they didn't practice law, they were definitely familiar with the law. His father had been a loyalist during the Revolutionary War, which meant he sided with the king over the colonies. And as such, he had to pretty much get out of town after the Revolution, and he went back to England. Edmund Randolph himself had served in the war on the side of the colonies. He was actually aide-de-camp to General Washington for a time. Anyways, this plan you'll read about, the Virginia plan, is usually called the Large State Plan. It favored the large states because it asked for a House of the Legislature to be based on state population, meaning the number of people in a state would determine the number of representatives that state gets to send to the legislature, the national legislature. Obviously now this is how the House of Representatives works, which is why some states have upwards of 50, like California, representatives, and other states that have only one, like Wyoming, because it's so small. Anyways, this whole idea of proportional representation is obviously going to be disliked by the smaller states. In the Articles of Confederation, the Congress, each state was equal. Each state essentially had one vote in the national parliament or the national legislature under the Articles of Confederation, and so they wanted to keep that system. They wanted to keep a unicameral, which means one house legislature, where each state would be represented. And you can see that in document 2, which is William Paterson's proposal called the New Jersey Plan. He was from New Jersey. He'd actually been born in Ireland. He was also a lawyer. He helped write the New Jersey Constitution, which is another thing to keep in mind as you're reading this stuff, is by this time all the states had written their own constitutions. And so there's a model out there of what government might look like from the state level, and those state constitutions are going to influence the debate that takes place at the national convention, constitutional convention. After William Paterson, he actually went on to serve in the Supreme Court of the United States in the years following the Constitution's ratification. Okay, so this plan is usually called the small state plan. He wants, like I said, to keep the unicameral legislature where each state has equal say, one vote. And notice that this would give Congress more authority to raise taxes on its own. And this proposal is also important because it introduces in its call for raising taxes proportionally, it calls for considering what are, it's not said, but what are enslaved people as 3/5 for enumeration. So you'll read an article about how they didn't like to use the word slave. They thought it was basically a shame. They were ashamed of slavery and the slave system. And so the Constitution, even though it treats slavery in 3 to 5 very specific ways, it never uses the word slave or slavery or enslavement. It refers to all other persons, typically. And this you'll see in the debate going forward. These next two documents come from James Madison. So James Madison, as you probably know, was often considered the father of the Constitution. He was sort of the brains behind the convention in the first place. And he led a lot of the debate. He was sort of like the mind behind all that's going on, and he's also pushing it politically in the debates after the convention when they were arguing over ratification. He would be the one, along with Alexander Hamilton, to really push for the Constitution. So these are his notes. So he kept notes during the convention, which was a secret convention. And many years later, after he was president, he published these for people to read. And that's where we get these from. So it's his recollections, it's him transcribing the notes he took at the convention. And it's really interesting. You'll see, the debate is over, the first one over, what should the country look like? How should the legislature be run? And the second is the debate over slavery and representation. Like, should slaves count fully? Should they not count at all? And you'll really see it's a very sectional debate. Even before the country's officially formed a government here, slavery is already dividing it north and south, and it's very clear in this debate. So pay attention to that. One of the issues, obviously, is how much will the South benefit by counting slaves either, fully or partially. And it turns out in the first 50 to 70 years of the country, the South had far more political influence over the national government than it otherwise would have, simply because they were counting their enslaved humans as 3/5. They were counting them at all, essentially. So, okay, so read the two debates, and then the final two things up there are a couple of academic scholarly articles. Enjoy those. The first one is over. It's how the word slave itself was kept out of all these things, and this article goes over, where the Constitution specifically protected and sanctioned slavery, which it most certainly did. So read that; it's very important, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in the lecture. And then the next one is about representation of women in the Constitution. And women couldn't vote. So should they have been counted in the enumeration of population? Same with kids, you could make the argument. And eventually turned out the Constitution doesn't use the word he or she at all. It is pretty gender neutral, and women are counted, and children are counted. All free persons, exempting natives who don't pay taxes. And she gets into that a little bit, but not quite as much. Okay, and then finally, here, I'd like you to just play around with this, and hopefully you'll learn something about the convention by doing so. I'm going to open the link. And it'll tell you you need a membership. I'm going to lose the volume here. But you actually don't. You can just hit cancel. And you'll get this intro screen. You just won't be able to save your work, but this will tell you the instructions, but it's fairly simple. Anyways, like I said, so every state had its own issues going into the convention, and in this you'll get to experience what a delegate from whatever state you choose. So Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, these are obviously all highly dependent on slaves, and then each one of them had a easier or more difficult chance to get the issues that they cared about resolved. Okay, and then obviously in the North they had very different issues they wanted to see resolved through the Constitution. And how are they going to manage to do that? So you'll choose a state and you'll see what their issues were. Maybe choose a couple of different states. The idea here is to give you a sense of how these 13 different states, and obviously Rhode Island chose not to participate. They would eventually ratify the Constitution, by the way, although they held out for a couple of years. So they were holdouts. They liked the Articles as is. As a small state, the Articles of Confederation worked pretty well for Rhode Island, which is why they didn't want to change it. So anyways, and so look at the different states, see what their issues were, see why their issues were what they were, and it'll help you better understand the creation of the Constitution in the first place. Okay, thanks, and I will see you in lecture.